is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, I'm Patty Tholahungva with Indian Country Today. In Alaska, the village of Kivalina is restricting all travel by air, by land, and by water. They want to make sure their village remains safe from the coronavirus. They have a population of 379 people there, and elders remember they were children in the 1918 influenza pandemic, and they want to make sure their village remains safe and doesn't have the devastating effects that the influenza in 1918 had when entire villages were wiped out. So in addition to that, they have decided to provide fuel and ammunition to hunters so they can go out and stock up on food, and in case that they won't get any more provisions flown in during this pandemic. So news coming out of Alaska this morning. And for the total on the impact of the coronavirus across Indian country, let's bring in Jordan Bennett-Begay. She's our Washington editor. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Patty.
Every day we wake up to new numbers and understand they're reported late at night. So we are looking at the new numbers today. What is the update, Jordan?
Yes, the total right now in the Indian health system, there is a total of 796 cases and a total of 33 deaths within the Indian health system. And again, just as a reminder to viewers out there that Indian Country Today is keeping a database separate from the Indian Health Service. And the difference in our database is the whole Indian health system is, comprised of tribally run health facilities and the Indian Health direct services. So IHS has access to the data from these direct service facilities, but not the tribally run facilities. IHS does encourage these tribally run health facilities to report their data to them, but that doesn't always happen. So Indian Country Today is actively, looking for these cases and reaching out to tribes themselves.
And so really trying to collect that information so we know what's happening to our people across Indian country. Now, this weekend, the Navajo Nation is going into an entire weekend-long curfew. And we're getting word of that as we also hear that the president and vice president are both in self-quarantine.
Yes, they are. The Navajo Nation, actually the Navajo Nation president, vice president, potentially were exposed to people who were possibly had COVID-19. But the Navajo Nation is under a 57-hour lockdown for the weekend as a means to reduce, the exposure to everybody else. And just like last night, like they are getting closer to, getting almost 100 cases overnight. Just last night, they had a total of 70 more cases, and I think it was like two more deaths last night. And it's just really startling because it took, in the whole Indian health system, it took a couple weeks just to get a total of 100 cases. And now every day that's building up where we're seeing 100 cases reach within 24 hours.
And that really shows that if you don't social distance, if you don't isolate, that virus is passed on from person to person.
Oh, yes, definitely. And so that's what the CDC is recommending people when they go out to grocery stores or to pharmacies to cover their mouths, to consistently wash their hands, and of course to remain that physical distance of at least 6 feet, 6 to 10 feet they recommend right now. And when you come back from the grocery store, to wash your hands or hand sanitize as much as you can, just and disinfect, everything, because you don't know, and you're also trying to protect yourself and protect others from yourself too.
And then when you bring those groceries home, the recommendation is that you wipe them down, which is that's not what a lot of people do on a regular basis. But now they're really being encouraged to wipe down those groceries.
Yes, wiping down cardboard. There's a lot of doctors out there recommending how to go about this. So I would tell viewers, to go out and seek those videos. We can also post something under this broadcast that would show people, how they can go about being a little more diligent about cleaning the vegetables or the groceries they bring back from home too.
Wiping every bit of the packaging down, and then also throwing out the bags, which goes against this whole idea of recycling or returning the grocery bags to the store, because that's just not safe. Jordan Bennett, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Patty.
And we'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today. This is Indian Country Today.
Welcome back. We are joined today with our Reporters Roundtable with Savannah Mahr, and she is the Tribal Affairs reporter with Wyoming Public Radio. Welcome to our program, Savannah.
Thank you, Patty.
We also have with us today Cindy Yurth, and Cindy is the assistant editor with the Navajo Times. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hello. And finally, Aliyah Chavez, who is a reporter here in Phoenix with Indian Country Today. Thank you so much for joining us, Aliyah.
Good morning, Patty. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're all just been working nonstop, I imagine, since, first part of March here. And first cases that started coming out in Indian Country that really rang the warning bells was on the Navajo Nation. Cindy, tell us a little bit about the beginning of your reporting experience with the coronavirus.
Well, there were the first cases, there were 2 cases in the tiny town of Chilchinbeto, and our Western Agency reporter immediately jumped on it and was able, within days that was up to 14, and then it just kept growing, and we had some great enterprise reporting by our Western Agency reporter, Krista Allen, and she was able to trace all the cases back to a religious rally that they had for one of the churches. So we immediately started getting the statistics from the IHS. We put together a coronavirus tab for our website, and we've been following it ever since. It's now up to, 488 cases with 22 deaths.
That's it really just shows how much the spread is when you have contact with other people, to be able to trace it back and to give people an idea of where Chilchinbeto is. It's way up in northern Arizona on the western side, and the largest communities up there are like around Page and Flagstaff.
Yeah, probably. Kayenta is the largest nearby town on the Navajo Nation, and yeah, it would be east of Flagstaff, maybe about 100 miles east of Flagstaff, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so very remote area. So was that surprising that it showed up in a very remote area as opposed to the capital of the Navajo Nation in Winter Rock?
It was. We were kind of watching for it to crop up in Gallup and kind of make its way west, but instead it cropped up in this tiny town and almost immediately spread west and south, and now it's in Tuba City. These towns in western Navajo, the small towns, a lot of those people went to that rally. So it hit the rural area first, the most rural area that was probably the least prepared.
Yeah, it's just been devastating to watch how it's come across. And we are looking to interview people who are survivors of the coronavirus. So we'll keep an eye out for that and continue to follow these cases, because people do survive, and the majority of people will survive this coronavirus. But it's just scary because you don't know who is susceptible. So let me go to you, Savannah, and ask about when did this hit your radar screen in Wyoming?
Sure. Well, about 2 weeks ago, or about 3 weeks ago now, we had our first case in Wyoming, and shortly after we had the first case here in Fremont County, where I am, and where most of the Wind River Reservation is within. And the first cases in our county were related to a retirement home here in Lander, which is a border town on the border of Wind River. And soon after that, as far as I can piece together, a staff member at that retirement home who lived in Ethatee, a community on the reservation, brought the virus home without knowing it, and several members of one family tested positive for the virus. And we now have 13 cases on the Wind River Reservation, and hundreds more that have been told to self-isolate in their homes and sort of assume that they have the virus and to act accordingly. We're very lucky not to have had any deaths so far, but it's a scary time for Wind River.
How are the people who've been tested positive, how are they being treated and their families being treated? Because we've had another case with another tribe, and the chairman basically said, if you're caught spreading false information, or if you're caught passing on hate kinds of postings, that tribal members could get fined like $500.
Wow. So you mean in terms of how they're being treated by other members of the community? As far as I can tell, everyone has been really supportive of the families that are dealing with this. I haven't heard of anything like that, of anyone needing to impose any fines for sounds like people speaking badly about others. I think the community has been really supportive, and Wind River there's a stay-at-home order on the reservation, which is a step that Wyoming is one of the very few states that has held out on issuing an order like that, but Wind River has a stay-at-home order. There is a curfew for young people not to be out past 9 p.m. or before 5 a.m. So I think the reservation is responding certainly more aggressively than the state, I think more aggressively than the county, and people are taking it really seriously.
Well, so that's very interesting. It's good to hear too, because that people are being respectful and also not ostracizing those who have been tested positive for the coronavirus, because it's a time again where people, villages have to come together, tribes have to come together. So that's really good to hear. And also to hear that the tribal members are listening to that leadership and the message to stay at home. Let me bring back in Cindy, because that really wasn't the case with the Navajo Nation, and now they're under an entire weekend curfew.
Yes, people were slow to respond to the stay-at-home order. Even now, there's plenty of people on the road. I'm not sure why people aren't listening, but President Nez has responded with ever tighter restrictions, including this weekend. It's an entire curfew from 8 p.m. tonight until 5 a.m. Monday morning. Nobody but the very essential workers are to be out of their houses.
And he's also said, if you're out without a good reason, like going to the grocery store or going to get medicine, you'll be fined.
There's a maximum $1,000 fine, and you could be jailed.
That is pretty strict. I spoke with a friend up on the Navajo reservation yesterday, and he said that he was going into the store to get some groceries, and he passed by the post office, and there was a young person who drove up with an elder, woman in his truck. And when he got to the post office, he stayed in the truck while she went in to go check the mail. And he just said, I just can't believe that the person first would bring the elder out, and second wouldn't just go in and get the mail on his own. So we don't know why people behave this way, but this is sending a strong message this weekend by the president to shut down the nation.
Yeah, I hope people listen. I hope they start taking it seriously, because if you look at our growth curve, we actually have the statistics plotted out on our website under the coronavirus tab, and you can see it's exponential, which means it's not being controlled.
So let's go to Aliyah Chavez. Aliyah, you had a story on earlier this week, and we understand that the Navajo Nation is within also New Mexico, but you reported on a story about the tribal response to the coronavirus.
Yeah, that's right, Patty. So earlier this week on Wednesday, the New Mexico Department of Health released numbers from the San Felipe Pueblo and Zia Pueblo. And in this small pueblo of Zia, they had 31 confirmed cases. And to put that in perspective, there's only about 900 residents in this small village of Zia Pueblo. And so when you do the math, that's roughly 3% of their tribal population who has contracted the virus. And so that really spurred action from the Indian Affairs Department in New Mexico, who yesterday released a tribal response plan. And really what that is a guidebook for tribal leaders to turn to. Tribal leaders have never dealt with this before. There's never been anything as extreme as this pandemic has been. And so it has really called for, what do we do? How do we handle this in our communities? And so, tribal leaders were saying there's guidelines from the CDC, from departments of health, but there's nothing tailored to Native communities, which, as we all know, have very important values with Native ways of life. And so this guidebook really tells tribal leaders in New Mexico specifically, what do you do if someone contracts the virus? What do you do? How do you sort of close down your tribal roads? Or unfortunately, what happens if somebody passes away? How do you sort of change your funeral ceremonies? And so I spoke yesterday to a longtime tribal leader. His name's Regis Pecos, and he's from Cochiti Pueblo. And he said, there's never been a response like this on behalf of tribal leaders coming together to really address this emergency. And so, they're hoping, as in the Navajo Nation, that the curve really flattens and that no one else contracts the virus.
Yeah, it was quite a remarkable joint effort. There are 19 pueblos in New Mexico.
19, yes. And as well as the Navajo Nation and 2 Apache nations as well.
And so they had buy-in from all the different tribes in New Mexico.
That's what it sounds like. When I was speaking to Regis yesterday, he was saying that, he was a former governor of Cochiti Pueblo, and he was saying the only real emergency plan that they've ever had came after some devastating fires about 5 years ago, when tribes had to come together to work with FEMA and get some relief funds. And so he said, there's only a handful of us who really know how to deal with an emergency. And so it really took them coming together to sort of draft this tribal response plan.
It is really remarkable because, again, to have an entire joint effort by all the tribes in one state to say this is our best advice. And of course they have to tailor it, but do you have an example of what they were saying, like in terms of respecting cultural values and yet following government guidelines?
Definitely. So the 19 pueblos of New Mexico, I'm from Giwa Pueblo, which I apologize, I failed to mention. A lot of them still conduct their funerals in very culturally specific ways. And so that oftentimes comes in the form of, people being invited to the house of the deceased so that they can pay their respects, or large gatherings of feasts and food, given that that's something that you share when somebody passes. And so something that was in the plan that the tribal leaders addressed is that, this is an unprecedented time, and it means that you're going to have to change the ways of how you normally handle funerals, just because you can't have mass gatherings right now. That's not something that anyone is really urging, given that this is a time of social distancing. And so the tribal leaders really, were mindful about how do you pay the respect of the person who passes away, while also remaining true to your core values, and in a time when it's just not safe to be around other people right now.
Wow, it's just so much to think about and to consider, and to give yourself permission to not go through those traditional burials, because it puts everybody else in danger.
Yes, definitely.
Wow. So Savannah, when you were out there reporting on this case, what surprised you in looking at the landscape out there?
What surprised me? I'm not sure about what I found surprising. There was a lot that at the very beginning of this pandemic I knew before the illness had even reached Wyoming, that I knew was going to be a problem out here on Wind River. And I mean, one of the first things that came to mind, because I had been doing some reporting on it for the past month or two, was housing on Wind River, and how there's been a housing crisis here for decades now. because, you know, federal funding for Indian housing programs has been virtually frozen for a long time. If you take a look at the budgets for things like the Indian Housing Block Grant Program, and they really haven't kept up with inflation. And here on Wind River, the federal money that the tribes get for housing every year is pretty much enough for maintenance on the homes that they have, but not enough to build new homes. And so there are a lot of homes where you have 10, 15, even 20 people sharing a 2 or a 3 bedroom home. And so that, of course, has always been dangerous and not the best thing for these families, but now it is especially dangerous with this pandemic. And so some of the things that the tribes have been doing to innovate and get around that problem, the 2 casinos, the Shoshone Rose Casino and the Wind River Casino, that are both, of course, closed because of the pandemic, have taken hotel rooms and turned them into isolation rooms for people that are sick that need to be isolated from their families. And I've been seeing a lot of things like that. You know, I think there's been a lot of reporting about the ways that Indian country is especially vulnerable to the pandemic, which, of course, a lot of those things ring true around here. But I'm also seeing ways that the community is particularly resilient and particularly, I think, well equipped to handle this. And coming up with some great ways like those isolation rooms to keep people safe.
That's really great to hear that the tribes up there are doing that, because Buffalo Thunder, which is owned by the village of Pewaukee in New Mexico, also announced it's opening up its hotel to house people testing positive for the coronavirus.
Oh, that's great.
Again, they come from homes where there are many people living in one home, and it's really it's hard to isolate. It's hard to have your own space there. So that's really wonderful. And you're right. This idea, the disparities with housing and with education, you know, the hot spots that I think you mentioned in one of your reports. You know, there's that digital divide. The people, you know, sometimes when you think about America, you just think that everyone has access to the internet, but that's not true, is it?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, here on Wind River, the estimate from Wind River Internet, which is a tribally run provider that is pretty much the only internet provider that services Wind River, their best estimate is that about a third of homes here have internet access. And so that I spoke with the executive manager of that company on Monday, and he said it's just been, I mean, they're in the middle of a broadband expansion project on Wind River that unfortunately they had to pause for the winter when the ground is too hard to install fiber optic cables and things like that. But he's getting a lot of calls from families that want to get hooked up to the internet or would like to get hooked up to faster internet because they have 4 or 5 kids that need to be on Zoom classes. But then, of course, there are the families that don't have internet at all. And the schools on the reservation, I think, have been doing a good job of accommodating those families. At least one school hasn't gone online at all yet, specifically because they know there are students that just can't participate in that kind of a class. But yeah, internet connectivity is a huge problem right now.
Wow. Well, one thing, or one group of people we really have to thank are all the truckers who are out there and delivering food and supplies, all kinds of things. And Aliyah, your story mentioned some native truckers.
Definitely. So Indian Country Today published a story earlier this week as well about, asking how are all of our essential workers out there, our nurses, our doctors, how are they holding up? And so, I was really wondering, how does this toilet paper get to the grocery store that everybody wants? And so, it comes at the expense of truckers who, have to drive very long routes and work really hard hours to bring us all of these goods that we need in our homes. I spoke to a woman who's Navajo. Her name's Ornell Wilson, and she's a driver for Dr. Pepper in Houston. And she was saying, I can't believe so many people are ordering soda right now or need soda. And
I'm guilty on that. We thank her. So the other thing that's interesting, Cindy, you also report on the Hopi reservation. And I was really tickled to see that a village store was offering curbside pickup.
Yes, Hope Villa store is offering call ahead orders, and they'll fill them for you, run them out to the curb. Of course, as you know, Patty, the Hopi ceremonial cycle involves whole villages being in small packed spaces. So that they're a little worried because the cycle just ended, the winter dances ended in mid-March, that they're going to have a lot more cases. The village of Bakavi, where they do have one case, has closed its borders to everybody except village residents, and they're taking some pretty aggressive steps.
Well, I want to thank each one of you for sharing your reporting stories on our Reporter Roundtable today. Cindy Yurth with the Navajo Times, Savannah Mahr with the Wyoming Public Radio, our own Aliyah Chavez with Indian Country Today. That will do it for this edition. I'm Patty Thalahunga. Well, thank you to all of our reporters for joining us on our roundtable today. I'm Patty Thalahunga. Take care of yourself. Your life is precious. Thanks for joining us. Have a safe weekend.
This is Indian Country Today.